Well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. It's great to have people back in person, and we know we're sort of on the tail end of COVID when we can smell Aver's Pizza. I think we finally achieved a good sign. Well, good afternoon. I'm the Dean and James H. Rudy Professor here at the Maurer School of Law, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's 2022 Jerome Hall Lecture. Jerome Hall was a beloved faculty member of our school from 1939 until 1970. He was a pioneer in interdisciplinary analysis of legal problems, and his scholarship on criminal law and jurisprudence was internationally recognized. Though he passed away in 1992, his work is still cited regularly. Professor Hall's focus and approach has a deep place in our institution's history. The law school's library, the Jerome Hall Law Library, is named in his honor. Our faculty continue to embrace Hall's work in their research and writing. His work was driven by the belief that understanding how law develops and its impact on society and culture is best understood through interdisciplinary analysis, and that we understand law better when we examine it through different lenses, situating law in its historic, economic, political, ethical, and social context. It's also the belief that a true culture of democracy requires an informed citizenry that is comfortable in talking about and thinking about law. Law both reflects and defines social values. The Jerome Hall Law Lecture Series brings together influential and remarkable scholars to the Maurer School of Law. Recent lectures have included Malcolm Feely from UC Berkeley, Rachel Moran from UCLA, UCI Law Schools, Thomas Green from the University of Michigan, Sanford Levinson of the University of Texas, June Corbone from the University of Minnesota, Janie Schwang from the American University, and most recently, Kevin Johnson from UC Davis School of Law. Today, we're fortunate to welcome this distinguished list, a fabulous scholar, an award-winning teacher, and one of the nation's leading experts on election law and racing law. I'll now turn the podium over to Professor Luis Fuentes-Rohr, who will formally introduce this year's distinguished speaker, Professor Guy Charles. Luis, the podium's yours.
Thank you, Dean. Oh. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Good afternoon. I should tell you, I've known Guy Charles for about close to 30 years. So since I was bestowed the honor of introducing him, I've been thinking about, what do I say? Understand, I've roasted Professor Charles many times before, and it's really not that hard. For example, I will tell you that, in fact, I will not tell you, we're not doing that here, that were you to play football with him, and you were to run a really tight, skinny post and beat him to the end zone, he'll grab your shirt. It'll pull really hard. It'll hurt you almost. Then he will deny it then and to this day. I will also tell you, if you play basketball with him, bring a helmet. He takes it very seriously. I will not tell you about his sandals. I also will not tell you the things that you could find out for yourself if you were to go to the Harvard Law School website. For example, he began teaching at the University of Minnesota Law School in 2000 through 2009. In 2006, he was named its active dean, interim dean. I'm not sure about the difference or that it matters. That's pretty amazing. 6 years in, he was the dean of the Minnesota Law School, a co-dean. In 2009, he went to Duke Law School, where he taught until last year when he moved to Harvard Law School. While there, he won distinguished teaching awards, both at Duke and Minnesota, and I'm sure he'll win many others at Harvard. He's been a visiting professor at Georgetown, Virginia, Columbia, among other places. He served on boards, working groups. So I don't want to tell you about that in my very brief time. Instead, I will tell you very briefly, it's not my time, though it should be, about what I call the chicken scratch incident. I'll be brief. You wish I weren't, but I have to be. It's not my moment. Think post-Bush versus Gore 2001, think Tallahassee, think big things are happening. Well, Guy and I decide, Professor Charles, to go. We didn't decide, we're invited. He's invited, I come along to a major conference about the fallout of Bush versus Gore. So we sit in the back, we take it all in, big figures are talking. It's all really, really interesting. We have a talk coming up, and I look over and there's Professor Charles pulling out these scraps of paper. I'm like, what is he doing? And he's writing furiously. I'm thinking, oh no, he's writing his talk. He's dead. How is he going to pull this off? Next thing I knew, he gave an incredible talk. I mean, incredible. And I don't say this lightly. I don't know how he did it, but I'll tell you, that moment to me was just brilliant. I was like, wait, how did he do that? Well, fast forward 22 years. Professor Charles is going to deliver a lecture for us today entitled Identity Crises, Race Law, and the Multicultural Future. I don't know what he's going to say, but I can tell you, I am really, really excited about it. Professor, welcome to Bloomington. Thank you for being here. Floor is all yours.
So I should say thank you to my good friend, frequent collaborator, co-author. I first met Luis the very first day of law school. My recollection of him is he had a book in his hand and terrible sandals on his feet. And I think my sandals are better. And with respect to the football incident, Luis, I will admit, is a better basketball player, but I am a better football player and faster. What happened is that he was not fast enough. I caught up to him, slapped the ball out of his hand, and he has never forgiven me because I am just a better athlete. So that's all that was about. But it's been a pleasure to be his friend and his colleague. It's an amazing pleasure to be back at this amazing institution under awesome leadership. I have a number of classmates and friends that are here as distinguished academics. So in many respects, being back at Bloomington and being part of this great law school is in many ways to be back home. Thankful to Professor Deb Wittes, who issued the initial invitation. Thank you so much, really appreciate it. Among this faculty's distinguished scholars, my colleague Janine Bell, or I could go on to name the great academics that you have here. And this lecture will be also within the bailiwick of Professor Kevin Brown. So I'm particularly interested not just to hear what comes out of my chicken scratch, which was printed, by the way. So you could tell it wasn't just right now, though printed right before the lecture, but also very curious to hear what all of you have to say about this. I thank you for being here and for listening. My thoughts will be a bit inchoate. These are preliminary ideas that I have still yet to work out, but my thesis is simple and twofold. The first part of the thesis is that our country is in the midst of what I think of as an identity crisis. And by that, I mean that we're in a transition from a country that was understood as basically a white country to one that aspires and is on its way to be a multiracial, multicultural democracy. And the second part of the thesis is that our fundamental as our fundamental understanding of ourselves change, so will the way power and resources are distributed. To put it differently, the distribution of power and resources is in important ways part of the function of our identity, and in important ways who we are as a country. These are the stakes, and I think will explain the current moment in which we find ourselves, and that I will describe in a few minutes. I'm going to make my case and try to support my thesis by juxtaposing two related cultural convulsions, one about wokeness and the other one about CRT. And then I'll offer what I think is an explanation, understanding of of the new worldview, this multicultural impending democracy. And then I'll close with some final thoughts of where we ought to go from here. But let me start with an apology. I'm quite embarrassed to admit that I had to Google not too long ago the term woke. for the past few months, I have seen lots of people talking about wokeness and the problems of wokeness. Now, I should hasten to add in my defense that if you look at Google Trends, I was not the only person Googling the phrase, what does woke mean? Starting somewhere around 2016, people started Googling the phrase with the search peaking somewhere around March of 2021. Now, there are lots of young people in the room, so I'm sure you can and will educate us old heads. But I do have to admit that I was genuinely puzzled as I saw more people talking about the dangers of wokeness. And Luis could attest to this as someone who's very careful and cautious. If I hear danger, I want to be sure that I avoid danger. And if woke is dangerous, I want to avoid wokeness because it is very dangerous. Right, so take the following headlines telling us about the problems of wokeness and how it might be going away. Is Wokeness Almost Over? By Scott McConnell in the American Conservative. The fight back against wokeness has begun. Okay, where is that fight? This is by Frank Ferruti in Spike Magazine. While Wokeness Will Fail, Bret Stephens. The End of Woke is Nigh, by Peter Franklin. And perhaps one last one, Andrew Sullivan wrote in his Substack newsletter about the emerging cracks in the woke elite. Now, I'm even more embarrassed to add that even though the term woke has been utilized in African-American circles for a number of years, I really didn't pay much attention until the Childish Gambino song, Redbone, which came out somewhere in 2016, 2017. And some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the lyrics. Again, this is just for the old heads in the room, all of whom I think are sitting up front. So the lyrics, well, with one exception, the lyrics by Donald Glover, or where's Kevin Brown? He's probably not up front either. Yeah, close, okay. Right, I won't recite all of the lyrics because quite frankly, you know, all of you are already embarrassed and worried. They're not appropriate for this type of intellectual and mixed company. But the song does begin something like daylight. Dun, dun. I woke up feeling like you won't play right. Don't. I used to know, but now that don't feel right, it made me put away my pride. And you know, you are running the song through your head. Eventually there's a catchy hook that admonishes, stay woke. And when I first heard that song, actually for a very long time, I actually thought the song was really some cultural, politically correct movement about equality, staying woke, right? The importance of being vigilant. But I'm sure the younger people in this room recognize, and again, I had to look this up, that the song is really a complaint that the complainant wanted to have more sex with his partner. So for some reason, I completely misunderstood the song. And apparently I am sure that the debates about wokeness are really not about that, right? So I have to now figure out and think through what is going on in this cultural moment. And 2018, June 7th to be precise, the columnist David Brooks warned us of the problem of wokeness. That was the title of the column, The Problem of Wokeness. I'll add another confession. I actually really like Brooks. I know a lot of people don't. Maybe in this room, people don't like David Brooks. I find him generally insightful, and like a good columnist, I think he provides, at least for me, a way of thinking about a problem that wouldn't necessarily occur to me and that often causes me to reflect. So if David Brooks is going to tell me about the problem with wokeness, I'm going to read and I'm going to try to understand. Now, I think in the course of this, I might have some implicit, if not explicit, criticism of Mr. Brooks. But he begins his column by noting, or really bemoaning, the flag that he had received on social media for noting, after a recent school shooting, that as tragic as the school shooting was, there was much less gun violence in the time that he was writing, 2018, than there was in the early 1990s. Students were much more likely, 4 times as likely, to be killed by gun violence in the early 90s than they were almost 20 years later. Brooks says that his critics were calling him to task for not, here I quote, maximizing the size of the problem. From the perspective of his critics, his sin, as he understood it, was draining moral urgency and providing comfort to the status quo. Brooks labeled the source of that criticism wokeness. In the old days, prior to wokeness, he says, you would try to perceive the size of a problem objectively, and then you would propose a solution which might either be radical or moderate or conservative or liberal, but you were judged primarily by the nature of your proposal. Right? Put differently, wokeness does not allow an analysis on the merits, or as Brooks would put it in his own words, wokeness jams together the perceiving and the proposing. In fact, wokeness puts more emphasis on how you perceive a situation, how woke you are to what is wrong, than what exactly you plan to do about it. To be woke is to understand the full injustice. Brooks instructs carefully that wokeness is not new. Both the impulse to frame a social policy problem at its most extreme, characterizing the worst case scenario as the likely scenario, is an impulse that has been with us for a very long time. He's also quite perceptive or careful to note that wokeness is not the territory of one political ideology. Both conservatives and liberals have pitched their tents on the soil of wokeness. Though these days, he writes, wokeness is perceived as a left-wing problem. But he does concede that conservatives have sometimes succumbed to the impulse to be woke. Now, toward the last quarter of his article, Brooks does 2 things that I think are useful, at least for my purposes. First, he delivers on the promise of the title of the column. Recall that the title of the column is The Problem with Wokeness. And so far up to this point, we're not exactly sure what the problem is with wokeness, but finally he tells us very explicitly. The problem with wokeness is that it doesn't inspire action. It freezes it. To be woke is first and foremost to put yourself on display. To make a problem seem massively intractable is to inspire separation, building a wall between you and the problem and not a solution. So wokeness freezes the problem, and I'll return to this point later. Second, Brooks reveals the real target of his article, which is not really about school shootings, but is about race. Brooks doesn't go after race directly, does so first in a furtive way. He uses the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates to frame his point about race. So he says, there's a debate precisely on this point now surrounding the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates. Brooks then associates Coates with wokeness. Coates, Brooks tells us, is of course well known for seeing the problem of racism in maximalist terms. Coates is woke. It is in discussing Coates, and by extension and eventually more directly race, that Brooks is most instructive. The greatest danger of extreme wokeness, he tells us, is that it makes it harder to practice the necessary skill of public life, the ability to see 2 contradictory truths at the same time. And now Brooks, I think, gets to the heart of the matter. It is certainly true, he declares, that racism is the great sin of American history, right? concedes what critical race theorists would regard as the formal equality point in many ways, right? Racism is bad. It's the great sin of history. That it is an ongoing sin goes even a step farther. And the sin from which many of our other sins flow, right? Racism is bad, problem, and the source of many of our problems. But, and you knew there'd be a but, it is also true that throughout history and today, millions of people have tried to combat that sin and have made great progress toward it. The problem with wokeness, as instructed by Brooks, is that wokeness does not recognize sufficient progress. It misdirects passion. It sees half-empty glasses on a vista in which glasses are actually half full. Wokeness betrays. Right? So the setup is, on the one hand, we recognize that race is a problem and a fundamental one. But the next move is, but race doesn't define who we are. Right? It is retreating and in the past. Right? And I think Brooks captures, though perhaps unwillingly, the current moment in which we find ourselves. And now to the second cultural convulsion, I will now turn. Sometime in 2020, and I actually don't remember exactly when, I read an article, might have come to my attention on Twitter, though I don't fully recall. The article was about a controversy over critical race theory. And the controversy was over the contention that critical race theory was being taught to children. My first reaction, I have to admit, was denial. Long been exposed to critical race theory. I'd even taught it myself. I barely understood what it was, even as I was teaching it. Ask me what interest convergence is. If you pay me $1 million, I might make something up. Quite complex and difficult. It is being taught to first graders, amazing first graders. I won't say this in front of my kids, but they couldn't understand critical race theory when they were first graders. I thought critical race theory was niche. It was an inside baseball. It can't be the case that it is being now in the national consciousness as controversial because it is being taught to kids. Denial gave way to incredulity. I was incredulous, but then I had to cede that space to reality. There is an undeniable backlash against CRT. And as I will note in the moment, that backlash is really not about CRT in some respects, just like the question about wokeness. It's not really even about race, just like wokeness. CRT and wokeness, I think, are both convenient targets and starting points. I think CRT is a shorthand phrase. CRT and wokeness, and maybe before that, the phrase the race card. CRT has become a cultural term of art, a political signifier. I'll close with that point later, but for now I will refer to the Crt panic and take it on its own terms. But I think both CRT and wokeness are telling us about the fight over identity. And as I said in my opening, that the fight over identity is really a fight about power. The reality, whether fair or not, just or unjust, distorted or accurate, is that CRT is now identifiable as a divisive cultural issue. And it seems that every week there's yet another story about a group of parents yelling at one another and yelling at some hapless, bewildered school board about CRT. We're on the hunt for where CRT is being taught. So, for example, in June of last year, Sam Metz of the Associated Press reported, Nevada has become the latest flashpoint in a national debate over how to teach students about racism and its role in US history, with parents clashing over curriculum proposals. People wore MAGA hats and waved signs outside a packed school board meeting. This week in Reno, while trustees considered expanding K-5 curriculum to include more teaching about equity, diversity and racism. Opponents say the proposal would lead to the teaching of critical race theory, which seeks to reframe the narrative of American history. Critics say such lessons plan to teach students to hate the United States. Here's another story, this time a headline from the Texas Tribune of December of last year: death threats and doxing, the outcomes of mask mandates and critical race theory fights at a school board. Another story from CNN by Hume Law and Jack Hanna: clutching a page of notes, Bob Russo sat in the middle of a boisterous audience in the school gymnasium, reviewing what he wanted to tell the Douglas County School Board members when it was his turn to speak. Russo stood and approached the microphone. "I don't know about you, but I don't want Marxist blood in this country," he said, generating widespread applause. This was Russo's third school board meeting in 8 days. Russo really cares about CRT. Officials were holding town halls across the rural Northwest Nevada County to address concerns roiling the community, such as whether students were learning critical race theory in classrooms. Right? See lots of fights and tell many more stories over these issues. And these are not simply about stories. These cultural clashes have also led to a series of political actions, right, where school boards are banning the teaching of race or critical race theory. Legislatures are banning the teaching of race. By my count, at least 10 states have CRT or race bans. Another 20 have bills pending. My understanding is that there's some of that going on in this very state. Some believe that the anti-CRT fervor swung the Virginia gubernatorial election from Terry McAuliffe to Glenn Youngkin, right? This stuff matters not just as a question of culture, but also as a question of politics. So the question then is, why has wokeness and CRT become so controversial? I'll say a couple of things very quickly. If you followed this debate relatively closely, you'll recognize the name Chris Rufo. Rufo is a self-styled journalist and conservative critic who has made it his personal mission to attack critical race theory, and he's certainly a prime mover here. And one of his many articles, this one published in the Wall Street Journal, Rufo wrote, "Critical race theory is the latest battleground in the cultural war. Since the murder of George Floyd last year, critical race theory's key concepts, including systemic racism, white privilege, white fragility, have become ubiquitous in America's elite institutions. Progressive politicians have sought to implement anti-racist policies to reduce racial disparities, such as minorities-only income programs and racially segregated vaccine distribution." Rufo went on to write that critical race theory is a radical ideology that seeks to use race as a moral means of moral, social, and political revolution. The left-leaning media has sought to portray it as a lens for examining the history of racism in the US, but this soft framing obscures the nature of the theory, which maintains that America is an irredeemably racist nation, and the constitutional principles of freedom and equality are camouflages. Now, one impulse, and in all candor, this was my initial impulse, is to push back against the distortion of how CRT is being described, and to say, this is not what CRT is. And Rufo's definition and those of his acolytes, they're describing a theory that I think would be unrecognizable to those of us who teach critical race theory. Right, so here's a description from Ellie Crosney of the Heritage Foundation. "Critical race theory is a theoretical framework rooted in Marxism that posits individuals as oppressed or oppressor based on their skin color." You can provide many, many more examples of an amalgam of a lot of different things thrown together under the banner of critical race theory. And it's clear that the anti-CRT forces are not shy. They openly admit that their goal is to redefine critical race theory and to make it as unpalatable as possible. And this is why I think of these ideas, wokeness, CRT, as cultural signifiers. Right? In an often quoted statement, Rufo has tweeted, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category." Right? So there's been a deliberate attempt to redefine, right? We'll think of for a moment to what end, but an attempt to redefine. But it's clear that what Rufo and his colleagues have done is conflate at least 6 different things, some of which could be recognizable as critical race theory, CRT, yes, BLM, Black Lives Matter, Nicole Hannah Jones' 1619 Project, Ibram Kendi's Racial Justice Project, encapsulated in his book, How to Be Anti-Racist, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, DEI work, right? And anything related or having to do with race or cultural fights are thrown under that CRT umbrella. Right. So the initial impulse would be to say, hey, that's not what CRT is. Let's disentangle. Let's now fight the definition. Let's rethink what we mean by wokeism, for example. Right. From my perspective, I take 3 insights from critical race theory. So I would define critical race theory in 3 ways. At its most basic and reductionist, critical race theory is about race. Specifically, it is about understanding the importance of race in American society. Second, critical race theory is about the claim that racism is not exceptional or accidental. It is not the product of a bad actor. It is not about feelings. It is not about individuals. Racism is systematic and structural. It is about the outcomes of socio-political arrangements. Formal equality, laws that treat everyone alike, will not lead to the eradication of the racial order into racial subordination. Right? That's the structural claim. And then third, critical race theory is about law. Law is not neutral. Law constructs, law shapes. Law constructs race, law constructs and facilitates racial subordination. Law also facilitates racial liberation. Thus, for me, critical race theory means these 3 things. We must pay attention to race and racial inequality. That is, you can't fully explain and understand American society if you ignore race. It does not matter if you account for other things, but you must always pay attention to race. Doesn't mean that you have to give it effect all the time, but if you want to understand how American society is operating, you can't ignore race. Second, you can't fully understand racial inequality unless you understand its structural dimensions. Right? Individual bad actors or individual victims are easy to find, but they can also be a distraction if the goal is to address the root cause of the problem. So it's very easy to point to the officer who placed his knee on the back of a Black man's neck, or the officer who reached for a gun instead of the taser, or the individual who hunted down a Black man jogging on the street because he didn't think he belonged. There are lots of bad actors, individual bad actors with different levels of culpability. But if you want to get at the root of the problem, you have to think about the system that produced these individuals, the individual police officer, or the structure that allowed people to see Black life as less than. And then third, law has the power to ameliorate structural inequality, and it has the power to further entrench structural inequality. Right. So in my view, then, Professor Brown asked me to make some controversial statements. So here's one. Let's see how you like them apples. In my view, critical race theory is not congruent with DEI work or white fragility for that matter. Critical race theory's structural approach does not sit with DEI's individualist and psychological prescriptions. The tendency is to retort that, hey, critical race theory is different, and to embrace some, right, to embrace DEI, to embrace all of these umbrellas and to fight the definition. But I think though the tendency to make this into a definitional fight is strong, it must be resisted. Doesn't mean that that correction is not appropriate in many circumstances, it is, but we won't get to the deeper question as to why CRT has become controversial and why wokeness has become a cultural signifier. Rufo is simply an opportunistic individual. He sensed a change in the country. And I think he appropriately focused on CRT and 1619, and I'll say why now towards the final end. Return to the summer of 2020 and what was called the racial reckoning. This was the period in which this country was processing a spate of killings of Black people by the police and some civilians as well, in the case of Ahmaud Arbery. In particular, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the country seemed to come together to support racial justice, if only for a moment, and Black Lives Matter. People wanted an explanation of what was happening. We had a multiracial protest. The beginning of this racial reckoning saw bipartisan support for racial justice. In some respects, I think the protest indicated that something was different. And in fact, something was different. It reflected a shift in the power hierarchy. So recall here the preamble to the Constitution: we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Who are we the people? Well, for so long in the American context, we the people simply meant we the white people, right? For most of this country's history, that's what we were talking about. And the question was simply, how can we accommodate at the margins the non-white people, right? The Black people, the Native Americans, the Asians, the Latinos, right? So because this country was for the white people, the question of race was simply managerial. How do you manage it? We were securing the blessings of liberty only for ourselves. The first point of my thesis is that that framework has changed. In the past, race operated within some known constraints. I'll quickly name four, but dwell for a short period of time on the first one. But the first constraint is that white people were regarded as at the top of the hierarchy. So recall here, Harlan celebrated descent and Plessy. The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, and so it is. And prestige and achievements and education and wealth and in power. And so I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage and holds fast to the principles of constitutional liberty, right? This is one of our celebrated dissents, right? That's the framework that is operating under. I think for the most part, that's the framework within which American law has operated under. And Harlan, of course, goes on to say the part for which he is celebrated, right? Not that part, right? No one stands and applauds when you read that, right? When our common law professor in Indiana teaches that portion, you know, everybody kind of like, right, let's just skip that part. Let's go to the real part, right? But in my view, he says, the Constitution in the eyes of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There's no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind. Everybody's like cheering, yay, right? And neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. Go Harlan, and respect of civil rights, et cetera. All citizens are equal before the law, right? And here we applaud and we think about the importance and limits of formal equality. But I think one thing we learn from critical race theory is that these two ideas are in fundamental tension. You can't have a structural, social, sociological, institutional system that regards whiteness as dominant and then think that you could have a legal framework that treats everyone equally, right? Those two things are opposing, and one must give way to the other. If the white race deems itself to be dominant in this country and is so in prestige, achievement, education, wealth, and power, it can't be the case that law will in fact be colorblind. Law will simply reflect the power dynamics, and so it has. And Plessy is itself exhibit number one. But if the racial hierarchy changes, right, by the same principle, if the racial hierarchy changes, so too does law. So too does the way that we apportion and think through power. And so the first point is that we are no longer operating in a world in which white people are viewed as the dominant race and rightly deserving pride of place in education, wealth, power, and prestige. In this way, the country has changed. This was the simple but powerful claim of the Black Lives Matter movement. This unadorned statement, Black Lives Matter, was not an aspirational claim of a world to come. It was not about the mountaintop. It was not a claim of we shall overcome. It wasn't heralding a world that was in the distant future, but it was speaking of a present world. Black lives, in fact, do now matter. It was a claim of power. It was a declaration of a new world order that is descriptive of the world that we inhabit today. A reflection that the power dynamics have changed. We're fighting over wokeness, we're fighting over critical race theory, because of this recognition that once the power dynamics fully change, the distribution of everything else will follow. And so if you want to hold on to the present distributional framework, you also have to preserve everything that's left of the old world order. We no longer live in a world that's descriptive of the frame articulated by Harlan. Second, we no longer live in a world in which that is reflective of the Black-white paradigm. We no longer live in a world in which our primary disputes are about North and South or federal government versus states. These constraints are less descriptive of who we are today. Whiteness is on the defensive. The Black-white binary no longer describes and explains a truly multiracial, multicultural America. North and South matters less, and though federalism retains some significance, not as much as it did before. Race, ideology, partisanship, those are reflective of our divisions, but in a context in which everyone now believes that they are entitled to a seat at the table. We the people really no longer means we the white people. Race is no longer a question to be managed, but something that everyone has to reckon with. And so we fight about that reality. And I'll close with this. We find ourselves in a moment of uncertainty where everything that we once knew truly is up for grabs. We're fighting about things that we thought were settled. How to define racial equality? The Supreme Court will soon tell us in the context of affirmative action and voting rights. How should we think about abortion and reproductive questions? How should we think about religious liberty? How should we think about our understandings of identity? In many respects, critical race theory is an appropriate target because critical race theory is about the upending the racial order. Wokeness and the charge of wokeness is an attempt to hold on to the past. The question today is how we can build a multicultural and multiracial society in which we recognize that power, resources, ought to be apportioned very differently. The question is how we should understand the issue of inclusion and racial inclusion, and to what extent racial inequality is indicative of a broader problem, that race is diagnostic, that we have to struggle with expanding the pie for everyone, that inclusion needs to bring more people to the table, that we have to think through substantive rights, that inclusion is costly. And I'll close with these last words. Recently, in my critical race theory seminar, we read a piece by Derek Bell. And Bell focused on the importance of substantive rights, rights to education, rights to work, economic rights, and how those substantive rights changes the zero-sum dynamics of the existing racial order. The question here is, how do we make room for people who have been excluded, and how we expand the table to put more seats for all of those who are used to standing? If we understand the fight about critical race theory and the fight about wokeness as a fight about power, I think we can really come to terms with providing the type of responses that are meet for the day. That redistribution, rethinking the racial order is the only way to truly build a multiracial, multicultural democracy deserving of the name. Thank you.
Thank you. Very briefly, if you're here for CLE credit, the attendance code is 73898. Again, CLE attendance code 73898. We'll ask Professor Brown if you have a question, if you could, it's not that far, if you could make it here to capture it on the microphone so that not for us in the room, we know you're loud enough, but those of them in the webinar.
Mr. Brown, you're also welcome to come.
Thank you.
But socially distancing. No, certainly that was a wonderful speech, and I was sort of thinking through my time at CRT, because I was there in the beginning. It really was very active in the beginning, but like over the last decade, I'd kind of been completely away doing other things. So I've come back to it with all the controversy this year, and I've been thinking about it quite a bit. And you really kind of helped me think through my coming back and trying to understand what happened, because I don't think there's any question. We were talking to the legal system. And what we were primarily looking for was elimination of the intent test to determine equal protection violations, and a recognition that policies and programs to attack racial disparities should not be judged the same as policies and programs that further them. So we were attacking color blindness. And because we were directed towards the legal system, that's what we were trying to change. So if the question was, well, where does this go otherwise? Our answer was, well, the only place it goes is you have to have new justices on the Supreme Court. And then I started hearing my colleague, Professor Quintanilla, start talking about empirical critical race theory. And I'm like, this is a concept we would have completely rejected. But he started to show how you could prove the ideas that we were talking about. And that's what I began to realize is that what's going on now are people who are really trying to say, we want to go to the next step. And the next step has to be changing the dominant American cultural idea that has normalized the reality that whites are supposed to have more. So that really all of this is a fight about a dominant cultural idea that we have inherited from our past that simply says whites are supposed to have more.
Yes, I completely agree with you. That is, there is you saw this when in the reaction to President Biden when he said he was going to name a Black woman as a justice, right? Now, the reaction, some of it was simply political grandstanding, but some of the reaction was simply a recognition that race makes a claim on power and resources. Right? So if Professor Cheryl Harris were writing today, maybe she would have written an article with a different title, and the title would have been something like, Blackness is property, Latino-ness is property, Asian-ness is property, right? That is the attempt now to begin to say that the default assumption, sometimes explicit, but often implicit, about who is entitled to what, right? That default assumption is being eroded. And when it is being eroded, then we respond to it by calling it woke or calling it critical race theory. All right. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that we're not going to need to figure out how it is that we get along and redistribute power and resources in a way that's fit for the society that we currently have, right? That's going to be as important as well, particularly in a context in which we are so heavily divided, polarized over party, over identity, over religion, right? Over a whole series of cleavages in our society, right? So that task is significant. But the first move, and I think that first move has been roughly accomplished, is to, right, as you said, undermine the first, the prior regime, right? Which is to say, you can't simply show up and assume that whiteness entitles power.
Yeah, just go to the mic.
Hello there, this was amazing. I really appreciated everything you had to say. I guess my one question specifically is academia really where the solution is going to be found? I know it's always on everyone's minds a little bit, but I guess it stems from, we describe this as a fight, and the fight has been going on for a very long time. And it just feels like, if you're talking, it's almost like being in quicksand. Every time progress is made, or every time a step is made forward, or the numbers change, the rules shift, or there's greater action taken to keep the status quo. It feels like this, as you said, the system is designed to keep the power in place. And is it really by going through this method, or are we going to make that cultural shift through this way?
Sure. Does academia have a role to play? It has a role to play, right? But is it the primary locus? No, of course not. It's not the primary locus, right? I think all of us in this society, and no matter where we find ourselves, have to think about, what does justice mean for the 21st century, right? And that's on the private and public side of the divide. That is on inside or outside of academia, industry or not, right? What does justice mean in the 21st century? What are our claims to belonging that is simply not a function of status, right? And so can academia provide, Professor Brown talked about Professor Quintanilla's work on empiricism. So can academia provide support for claims? Sure. Can academia help in perhaps places with respect to legal academia litigation? Sure, maybe, but of course, part of that is the work of democracy itself. Right? It's the work of citizenry itself. It's the work of all of us to think through and to say, okay, it's not, your race should not determine your station, right? And so that task goes beyond academia. That task is the task of all of us as citizens. And so I think there's a pretty clear answer to that question. Academics should not be excused, but they should not also assume the hubris that we are all believes that we're the primary actors in the play, that we have the answers, or that we can solve these things by ourselves.
So again, thank you. This has been an absolute privilege to listen to you talk. So I've been working with Professor Brown on his CRT work, and specifically with the question of how do you talk to the people of Indiana about critical race theory, especially when you consider that Rufo and the Heritage Foundation are describing CRT in the most incorrect, unpalatable terms. And if it's not saying like, this isn't what CRT is, what you're describing, how do you talk to non-legal people about it?
So so part of what shocked me, honestly, like right with the whole critical race theory at the beginning, it was simply that it just seemed to me unbelievable that people were thinking and talking about critical race theory. And of course, all of you have seen not just sort of the people at the school board meetings when they're being asked, look, what is critical race theory? With a lot of people going, I don't know what it is, but I do know one thing, whatever it is, I hate it, right? Okay, so I think it's hard to have a conversation with people if it doesn't really matter what the content of the conversation is, right? It's sort of like me going to my doctor, and the doctor wants to say, hey, I want to have a serious conversation about what you need to do. And like, I don't really care what you're going to say. Whatever it is, I am not going to listen to it. Okay, right? So it strikes me as almost quixotic to try to engage in a definitional fight when the questions and concerns are not there, right? So then the question is, well, how should we, right? Where should we engage? And I think part of what Rufo does really well is an understanding that there are people in this society who feel left out, right? They feel like the world, the property investment in their identity has lessened. Their stock has gone low, right? And there's an attempt to take advantage of that, right? And so the question is, well, how do we create a framework and understanding that also brings other people in, that shows them, right? So because the key move is they don't care about you, right? It's not just that there's that the equality and justice means everybody gets an equal seat at the table. The argument is, no, you're going to lose out, right? They're going to treat you the way historically they've been treated, right? That I think is the claim, and where I think people who are trying to reach a broader range of folks to try to get them to understand and to create structures in which, yes, people can have, can feel that that their issues, their questions, right? So you have to deal with the fact that, look, some parents are genuinely worried about some things, right? So how do we talk and think through and address that worry, not the, no, let me tell you what Derek Bell actually said, right? I'm not equipped to do it, and some people try to pay me to do it, right? So I think that's much less useful than trying to address the core substantive claim, which is much harder and deeper.
The question is pushing.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe one last question and then.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hi, Professor. I have two brief questions. So brief questions. So
You're
CRT,
going to be the best academic ever.
all right. So CRT is built on, I think I was really inspired on what you said about building on the premise that of white supremacy, and when the structure change, the rule change, right? So over the past few years, as an Asian American, we have the Atlantic attack. We also have the fair admission lawsuit, right? So how do you think critical race theory can best response to the Asian community in particular? So that would be the first question. The second question is inspired by Professor Mary Mazzura, whom is one of the founder of the critical race theory. And one of the thought that she that people would ask her, or she would talk about, is the utopia world after her investigation of critical race theory. So I'd love to ask you, what is a utopia world under your research? Thank you.
I will try to combine both into one because I'm not as good of an academic as you will be. So here's the combination of both, right? Which is, sort of similar to the answer to the prior question. So, Asian communities in particular are sort of placed in this moment, right, in which there clear is bias and hatred, while at the same time told too that, hey, you are losing out on the distribution, right? And it's zero sum, right? So part of what I think was very interesting about how Derek Bell in particular wanted to think about these questions was how to change the framework so that it's not zero sum. And part of what, of course, race crits try to do is to understand how to put together a combination of groups and that are not being pitted against one another, right? So one has to be responsive to the claims of discrimination and violence that say, for example, Asian American communities feel, okay? But then also one has to think about the way that we distribute resources, right? So in the context of higher education, when we say to groups, like, we enforce a certain amount of scarcity, right? We enforce a certain set of hierarchy, and then we say to people, go and strive for that. Right? But can we change the scarcity frame? Right? Can we not simply look at status, but really try to get at the core question of merit? Right? So this is the flip side in some senses of David Brooks, right? Where he says, no, wokeness doesn't care about merit. What's interesting is that I think critical race theorists actually want decisions to be made on the basis of the qualities and the things that really do matter. So what does utopia look like? Well, utopia looks like a world in which we're having conversations about re-engineering the framework, right? In which it's no longer zero sum. Okay, let me stop there because I am well past my time.